45 years ago, on this hillside, a mother buried her only child. Samuel Bailey was 10, fishing in the creek below, when federal agents raided this hollow. They saw him running home and shot him in the back. The papers called it an accident.
Kentucky Fury. Maggie Bailey slaughtered 19 federal agents who killed her 10-year-old son. The deadliest massacre of federal agents in American history and the site of one mother's unspeakable vengeance. This is the true story of Maggie Bailey. Our story begins in the rugged mountain section of Harlan County, Kentucky, known simply as the Hollows. Rarely have these hills been without some sort of warfare or smoldering quarrel that was likely at any moment to burst into rifle fire. Hemmed in by the ancient Appalachian Mountains, the early settlers who lived along the Cumberland River and its countless tributaries were cut off from the outside world. And for over 200 years, each succeeding generation remained that way. There were no telephones and the roads were few, and travel was slow and tedious. Indeed, the advance of civilization in the outside world had skirted this mountainous region that had gained the reputation of being one of the most primitive and dangerous sections in all of America, and would ultimately give this place its infamous name, Bloody Harlan. From the early period when the hardy mountaineers fought the Indians all the way up until the 20th century, the inhabitants of this area had a tendency to take law into their own hands and to hand out justice according to their own ideas. This no doubt has been due in part to the fact that law and order has had a hard time trying to gain a foothold in this section of sparsely settled mountains. And during the 1800s, and even well into the 1900s, most of the region's inhabitants were mountaineers who lived a simple existence. Most of them lived in log cabins, surviving by farming and hunting and trapping. Schools and churches were few and far between. In fact, most children didn't even attend school, and those that did rarely did so for more than just a few months a year. The people of these hills had developed their own way of living, their own code of honor, and their own understanding of what justice meant. You see, one of the primary ways that mountain families survived in these isolated hollows was through the production of moonshine whiskey. This wasn't a criminal enterprise to them. It was simply what their grandfathers had done and their great-grandfathers before them, stretching back to the first Scots-Irish settlers who had brought the art of distillation across the ocean. The mountain corn that grew in small patches on the steep hillsides wasn't worth much on its own, but when it was transformed into whiskey, a man could carry a year's worth of income on the back of a single mule. And so, the stills bubbled away in hidden hollows throughout Appalachia, and the mountain people saw no wrong in what they did. The craft of moonshine production had been refined over generations, until it was as much an art as a necessity. Each family had its own recipe, its own methods, its own secrets passed down from father to son, and sometimes from mother to daughter. The Bailey family recipe was known throughout Harlan County for producing a whiskey that was smooth and clean, without the harsh burn that characterized lesser products. Maggie had learned this recipe from her father-in-law before his death, had perfected it through years of careful attention to every detail of the process. The copper still that sat in the hollow behind her cabin had been in the Bailey family for 3 generations, and the whiskey that flowed from it represented not just income but heritage. The process itself was time-consuming and required constant attention. The corn had to be ground and mixed with water and yeast, then left to ferment in wooden barrels for just the right amount of time. Too short and the mash wouldn't develop its full potential. Too long, and it would turn sour and unusable. The fermented mash then had to be heated slowly in the copper still, with careful attention to temperature and timing, to separate the alcohol from the water and impurities. The first liquid to emerge, called the foreshot, was toxic and had to be discarded. Then came the hearts, the good whiskey that was the whole point of the operation. Finally came the tails, weaker alcohol that could be added back to the next batch or discarded, depending on the distiller's preference. Maggie knew this process as well as she knew the paths through the forest or the names of her children. She could tell by smell alone when the mash was ready for distilling, could judge temperature by touch rather than thermometer, could predict the quality of a batch before the first drop emerged from the still. This knowledge was her inheritance, her connection to generations of Baileys who had lived and worked in these hills, and it was the only thing keeping her family fed after Samuel's death left her alone with 3 children to raise. But the federal government saw things differently. That's right. By the 1920s and 1930s, During the dark years of Prohibition and the Great Depression, the government had launched an all-out war on moonshine production. Revenue agents were sent into the mountains by the hundreds, armed with badges and guns, and the full authority of the United States government behind them. Their mission was simple: find the stills, arrest the moonshiners, and destroy the equipment that these families had used for generations. And the mountain people, well, they didn't take kindly to these outsiders coming into their hollows and telling them how to live. The stage was set for a conflict that would produce one of the most violent acts of retaliation in American history. And that's when our story truly begins, in a hollow deep in Harlan County, where a woman named Maggie Bailey lived with her 3 children. Maggie was 37 years old in the summer of 1932, a widow who had been raising her family alone ever since her husband Samuel died in a coal mine collapse 7 years earlier. The mine company had offered no compensation, no acknowledgement of fault, nothing but a curt letter informing her that her husband's remains could be claimed at her convenience. She had buried Samuel on the hill behind their cabin, the same hill where his father and grandfather rested, and she had taken over the family still to keep her children fed. That whiskey was the only thing standing between her family and starvation. Now, Maggie Bailey wasn't a woman who went looking for trouble, but she was a woman who understood it when it came knocking. She had grown up watching revenue agents burn stills and arrest men whose only crime was trying to feed their families. She had seen her own father dragged away in chains when she was just 12 years old, his still destroyed, his spirit broken by a year in federal prison. She had watched her mother waste away and die 3 winters later, her heart shattered by grief and poverty. These mountains had taught Maggie that justice was something you carved out for yourself, that the law served only those with money and power, and that the government was not a friend to people like her. You see, federal agents had been circling her property for weeks that summer, and Maggie knew that trouble was coming. She recognized the signs, the strangers asking questions in town, the unfamiliar cars parked on ridges overlooking her hollow, the nervous glances from neighbors who had heard rumors of a coming crackdown. She prepared as best she could, moving the still to a more hidden location, burying her reserve supply of whiskey in marked spots throughout the woods. But despite all her preparations, Maggie never imagined how devastating the coming storm would become. She never imagined that the agents would take from her the one thing she could not replace. Her son Thomas was 10 years old that summer, and he was the absolute light of her existence. He had his father's eyes, dark and deep like the coal mines that had claimed so many lives in that region, but he had his mother's spirit, fierce and independent and unwilling to accept the limitations that the world tried to impose. Thomas was a gentle boy who loved the woods, who knew every trail and every hidden spring in those ancient hills, who could track a deer through underbrush and identify birds by their songs alone. He helped his mother with the still, because that's what children did in their community. He carried water and wood, never fully understanding the danger that surrounded their modest operation. To Thomas, making whiskey was simply what families did to survive. Thomas had dreams that extended beyond the hollow where he was born, dreams that his mother encouraged, even though she knew how rarely such dreams came true for mountain children. He wanted to see the ocean, that vast expanse of water he had only read about in the tattered school books that passed from family to family in their community. He wanted to visit cities with buildings taller than the tallest trees, wanted to ride trains across the country, maybe even fly in an airplane someday. Maggie would listen to her son describe these dreams while they worked together, her heart swelling with love and breaking with the knowledge that poverty would likely confine him to these hills forever. But she never discouraged him, never suggested that his dreams were impossible, because she believed that hope was the one thing they could give their children freely. Thomas was also his mother's helper in ways that went beyond carrying water and wood. He had learned to read the weather by watching the clouds and feeling the wind, skills that helped determine when it was safe to run the still, and when federal agents might be more likely to be out patrolling. He knew the locations of every lookout point in the surrounding hills, places where a boy could sit quietly and watch the trails for approaching strangers. He had developed a system of bird calls that he used to communicate with his mother across distances, signals that meant safety or danger, or the need to hide. These were survival skills that mountain children learned early, and Thomas had proven himself adept at all of them. The federal agents who had been watching the Bailey property were led by a man named Harold Whitmore, a career revenue enforcement officer from Louisville, who had made his reputation by conducting aggressive raids that produced impressive arrest numbers. Whitmore was 43 years old and had been enforcing liquor laws for 12 years, long enough to develop a particular contempt for the mountain people he was tasked with controlling. He saw them as backward and lawless, obstacles to progress that needed to be crushed rather than understood. He had never lost a man on a raid, never faced serious resistance, and this success had bred in him a dangerous arrogance. When he received orders to shut down moonshine operations in Harlan County, he assembled a team of 23 agents and promised his superiors that he would make an example of the region's most notorious producers. And that's when things got ugly, because no one could have imagined what would happen on that August morning in 1932, and no one could have predicted the lengths that one grieving mother would go to in response. The raid was scheduled for an early August morning when mist still clung to the valleys and visibility would be limited until the sun burned through the mountain fog. Whitmore believed this would give his agents an advantage, allowing them to approach the property undetected and establish positions before the inhabitants were fully awake. He divided his force into 3 groups, one to approach from the main trail, one to circle around and block the back of the property, and one to remain in reserve. Each agent was armed with a rifle and a pistol, more firepower than any of them expected to need against a widow and her children, but Whitmore insisted on overwhelming force as a matter of principle. The morning of the raid began with a stillness that would later be remembered as ominous, a silence in which even the birds seemed to sense that something terrible was approaching. Maggie woke before dawn, as she always did, starting the fire in the cook stove, preparing breakfast for her children, going about the routine that had structured her mornings for years. Her 2 daughters, 16-year-old Sarah and 14-year-old Elizabeth, helped with the morning chores, while Thomas ate his cornbread and planned his day. He wanted to check his rabbit snares in the upper hollow, then maybe fish in the creek if the weather held. Maggie told him to finish his breakfast first. These were the last normal words she would ever speak to her son. Thomas finished eating and bounded out the back door with the energy that only children possess, heading toward the still house to grab a bucket for the creek. Maggie watched him go from the kitchen window, smiling at his enthusiasm. She did not see the agents moving through the trees. She did not hear the whispered commands as Whitmore positioned his men around the property. The first indication that anything was wrong came when she heard men shouting, harsh voices demanding surrender, boots crashing through underbrush. Her blood turned to ice in an instant, and her only thought was Thomas. She ran for the door, pushing past her daughters who stood frozen in confusion, screaming her son's name as she burst onto the porch. The scene before her was chaos. Armed men in dark suits were emerging from every direction, guns pointed at the cabin, at the outbuildings, at anything that moved. She saw the still house in the distance, saw smoke rising from where they had already set fire to her equipment, and then she saw Thomas. He was standing near the spring house, a bucket in his hands, his small body rigid with terror as agents converged on him from 3 sides. Maggie ran toward him with every ounce of strength in her body. The distance between them seemed to stretch into an impossible chasm. What happened next would be disputed for decades, but the result was undeniable. Agent Harold Whitmore would later claim that Thomas had reached for something in his pocket, that he believed the boy was going for a weapon. The other agents gave conflicting accounts, some supporting Whitmore's version, others admitting they saw nothing threatening in the child's behavior. What no one disputed was that 3 shots rang out across the hollow that morning, 3 bullets fired from Whitmore's service pistol. And when the echoes faded, Thomas Bailey lay crumpled on the ground, with blood spreading across his thin cotton shirt. Maggie reached her son's body seconds after he fell, dropping to her knees in the dirt that was already turning red with his blood. She gathered his small form into her arms, as if she could somehow hold him together through sheer force of will. His eyes were still open, those dark eyes that looked so much like his father's, and for one terrible moment they focused on her face with an expression of confusion and fear that would haunt her forever. She felt the life drain out of him as she held him, felt his body grow slack, felt the warmth of his blood soaking through her dress, And something inside Maggie Bailey died alongside her son that morning. The agents stood frozen around this scene, suddenly aware that they had committed an act that could not be undone. They had murdered a child in front of his mother over a matter of whiskey and taxes. Even Whitmore seemed shaken, his pistol still in his hand, his face pale beneath the morning sun. The screaming that filled the hollow came from Maggie's throat, though she would have no memory of making any sound at all. The birds had resumed their singing, oblivious to human tragedy, their songs providing an obscene soundtrack to the worst moment of her existence. They arrested Maggie that morning, dragging her away from Thomas's cooling body while she fought like a wild animal. They had to tie her hands and feet to transport her, had to restrain her to stop the screaming that unnerved even the most hardened agents. Her daughters were taken to a neighbor's house, briefly detained before being released, when it became clear that charging children would only make things worse. The body of Thomas Bailey was left where it fell, until a local undertaker arrived hours later, collecting the small corpse with tears streaming down his face. He had known the boy. He had sold him penny candy at the general store. Maggie was transported to the county seat and charged with illegal manufacturing and resisting arrest. She sat in her cell for 3 days without speaking, without eating, without acknowledging anyone who approached her. Her eyes were fixed on something that no one else could see. The federal prosecutors wanted her transferred to a larger facility, confident they had a solid case, but the local community had other plans. You see, Judge Elijah Stone was 71 years old and had served on the bench for 40 years, long enough to know the Bailey family and long enough to recognize injustice when he saw it. When the federal prosecutor demanded that Maggie be held without bail, Stone listened patiently before setting bail at $1. Maggie walked out of that courthouse a free woman, but everyone who saw her knew that something fundamental had changed. Her face had hardened into an expression that seemed carved from the same stone as the mountains themselves. Her eyes burned with a cold fire that made grown men look away. She did not speak to the neighbors who had paid her bail. She did not acknowledge the pastor who tried to offer words of comfort. She walked through the crowd as if they were not there, as if she existed in a different world now, a world with room for only one purpose. The funeral for Thomas Bailey was held 3 days later on the hill behind the family cabin, beneath an ancient oak tree where he had loved to climb and watch the sunset. Over 300 people attended from throughout the region, families who understood what had happened, who had suffered their own tragedies at the hands of distant authorities. No federal agents dared show their faces, though they watched from a distance with binoculars. The preacher spoke of innocence destroyed and justice delayed. The hymns were old mountain songs about going home, about crossing rivers to peaceful shores. Maggie stood at the center of it all, her face a mask of stone, her eyes fixed on the small wooden coffin. She stayed at that grave through the night and into the next morning, sitting beside the freshly turned earth as if keeping vigil for something that would never return. Her daughters brought her food and water that she did not touch, blankets that she did not use. The neighbors spoke in hushed tones about what she might do, whether she would recover or waste away. They did not understand that Maggie Bailey was not grieving in any normal sense. She was transforming, shedding the woman she had been, and becoming something new, something shaped entirely by loss and focused entirely on one purpose. And that transformation, that dark metamorphosis occurring on a hillside in Harlan County, would soon produce one of the deadliest acts of individual violence in American history. You see, the locals didn't take kindly to what had happened to Thomas Bailey, and Maggie's grief resonated throughout those hills like a cry of war. That's right. The mountain people had endured generations of abuse from outside authorities, had watched their fathers and brothers dragged away to prison for crimes they didn't consider crimes at all. They had seen their communities invaded by strangers who didn't understand their way of life and didn't care to learn. Thomas Bailey's death was not just one family's tragedy. It was a symbol of everything these people had suffered, everything they had lost, everything that had been taken from them by forces beyond their control. The transformation in Maggie was gradual but relentless, like a storm building over the mountains through days of heavy air and distant thunder. She resumed some routines of normal life, cooking for her daughters, tending the garden, even rebuilding the still. But those who knew her could see that something fundamental had changed behind her eyes. She stopped attending church, stopped accepting visitors, stopped engaging in the small talk that had once connected her to her community. She spent hours each day sitting on her porch, staring at the tree line where the agents had emerged that terrible morning. What the community did not know was that Maggie Bailey was planning something that would shake the foundations of federal law enforcement. She had begun mapping the movements of every agent who had participated in the raid on her property, learning their routines through careful observation and information gathered from sympathetic sources. She discovered that most of them were staying at a boarding house in the nearby town of Harlan, a place they returned to between raids on other properties in the region. She learned their schedules, their habits, their weaknesses, and she filed this information away in a mind that had become as cold and precise as the steel of a rifle barrel. She began practicing with her husband's old weapons, firearms that had hung unused on the wall since his death. Her father had taught her to shoot when she was younger than Thomas, and she had been good at it, patient and steady, in the way that mountain life required. Now she practiced for hours each day in a remote hollow where the sound of shots would not attract attention. She honed her accuracy until she could hit a target the size of a man's head from distances that would challenge even experienced marksmen. Her daughters noticed the ammunition she was using, the time she spent away, but they knew better than to ask questions. Every night after her daughters had gone to bed, Maggie would sit at the kitchen table with a single lamp and plan. She drew maps of the boarding house from memory, having walked past it dozens of times over the years. She calculated lines of fire, escape routes, approaches that would minimize the chance of detection. She made lists of the agents she could identify, placing Harold Whitmore's name at the top and circling it with marks that grew darker each time she reviewed her plans. The mother who had once been known for her kindness was becoming something forged in grief and sharpened by rage. 2 months passed, and the leaves began to change color on the mountains. The federal investigation into Thomas Bailey's death had concluded with a finding that Agent Whitmore had acted appropriately, that the shooting was justified based on his reasonable belief that he faced a threat. This finding was released to newspapers throughout the region, accompanied by statements praising the professionalism of the agents involved. Maggie read these articles without expression, cutting them from the newspapers and adding them to a file she kept hidden. Each word of official justification added fuel to a fire that was already burning beyond any possibility of containment, and that's when Maggie Bailey decided to act. On a cold October night, when the first frost was settling over the hollows and wood smoke rose from every chimney in the county, Maggie put on her darkest clothes, loaded her weapons, and kissed her sleeping daughters goodbye. They did not wake, did not see her pause at the door for one final look at the lives she was about to leave behind. She walked out into the darkness and made her way down paths she had known since childhood, moving with the silent confidence of someone who belonged to these hills in a way that outsiders never could. The moon was just a sliver, providing enough light to navigate, but not enough to expose her to anyone watching. The town of Harlan was quiet at 3 in the morning, its streets empty, except for stray dogs and the occasional drunk. Maggie approached from the east, using alleys and backlots to avoid the main roads. She knew this town as well as she knew her own hollow, had come here for supplies throughout her entire life. The boarding house stood at the edge of the commercial district, a 3-story wooden structure that had once been a hotel during the coal boom years. Now it housed transient workers and, temporarily, the federal agents who had murdered her son. She had learned from a sympathetic local that the agents occupied the entire second floor, 12 men who rotated through various enforcement duties. What she did not know was that 7 additional agents had arrived that very evening, reinforcements sent to increase pressure on moonshiners before winter. This meant that instead of facing 12 armed men, Maggie would encounter 19. But this revelation would not have changed her course even slightly. She had come to kill every agent she could find, and whether that number was 12 or 19 made no difference to a woman who had already accepted that she would not survive the night. She entered through the kitchen at the back of the building, using a key left by the cook in exchange for enough money to leave town forever. The kitchen was dark, except for the glow of banked coals in the cook stove. Maggie moved through this space with careful steps, testing each floorboard before committing her weight, timing her movements with the wind that rattled the windows. She carried 2 rifles and 2 pistols, more weaponry than she could effectively use, but enough to ensure she would not run out of ammunition. The stairs to the second floor creaked as stairs in old buildings always do, but Maggie had anticipated this. She removed her shoes, placing them in the corner of the landing, and continued upward in stockinged feet that made barely any sound. The second-floor hallway stretched before her, doors on both sides leading to rooms where men slept peacefully. A single lamp burned at the far end, casting just enough light for her to identify the doors. She had memorized the room assignments from information gathered over weeks of patient observation. She knew exactly which door led to Harold Whitmore. She found him in the 3rd room from the stairs, sleeping on his back with one hand thrown above his head. Maggie stood over him for a long moment, studying his face in the dim light, remembering how he had looked standing over Thomas's body. She had imagined this moment countless times, had rehearsed what she would feel when she finally confronted her son's killer. What she felt was a cold clarity, an absence of everything except purpose, as if all the heat of her grief had been compressed into something as hard and cold as the metal in her hands. She raised her rifle and did what she had come to do. The sound of that first shot shattered the silence and set in motion a chain of events that would unfold with terrifying speed. Doors flew open up and down the hallway, confused voices calling out questions that would never be answered. Maggie had anticipated exactly this chaos and used it to her advantage. She stepped back into the hallway and fired at the first figure to emerge from a neighboring room. She did not aim carefully, because careful aim was not necessary at this range. She did not hesitate, because hesitation would mean death before her work was complete. The second agent fell before he could cry out. The third managed to fire a wild shot that embedded itself in the ceiling before Maggie's return fire found him. She moved through the hallway like a ghost of vengeance, her years of hunting experience translating perfectly to this different kind of prey. They stumbled from their rooms half-dressed and blinking sleep from their eyes, reaching for weapons they could not find in the darkness, calling out to companions who were already dead on the floor. Maggie showed no hesitation and no mercy. Her grief transformed into something mechanical and precise. Some agents tried to flee through windows, dropping to the ground below, only to find themselves injured and exposed in the pale moonlight. Others attempted to barricade themselves in their rooms, pushing furniture against doors that were never designed to withstand determined assault. Maggie moved methodically from room to room, kicking through these barricades with strength born of something beyond physical capability. The agents inside died, as their companions had died quickly and without chance to make peace with whatever gods they worshipped. One young agent named Daniel Crawford managed to take cover behind an overturned dresser and fire several shots that came close enough to tear through Maggie's sleeve and graze her arm. She felt the hot streak of the wound, but registered no pain, only a slight adjustment in her stance as she calculated the angle. Crawford was crying, his shots growing wilder as terror overcame whatever training he had received. She found an angle that exposed his position and fired twice. The crying stopped. The entire engagement lasted less than 15 minutes from the first shot to the last. When the shooting finally stopped, silence descended with a weight that seemed physical, broken only by distant sounds of dogs barking and voices calling questions into the night. Maggie walked through the building one final time, confirming what she had done, counting bodies, making certain that no one remained alive who had been present when Thomas died. The air was thick with gun smoke and the copper scent of blood. She found Harold Whitmore where she had left him. Still in his bed, his face frozen in surprise. She stood over him again, looking down at the man who had taken everything from her. Thomas was still dead, still buried under that oak tree, and killing these men had not brought him back. Nothing would ever bring him back. But something had been balanced, some cosmic scale adjusted, and the men who had stolen her son would never steal another child from another mother. Maggie left the building through the same door she had entered, pausing only to retrieve her shoes from the landing. The eastern sky was beginning to lighten, the first hints of dawn appearing behind the mountain ridges. She knew she had very little time before the carnage was discovered and the hunt began. She had prepared for this, had hidden supplies throughout the surrounding wilderness, had planned escape routes deep into hills where even the most determined searchers would struggle to follow. The town awoke to horror as full dawn revealed what had occurred. A cook arriving to prepare breakfast found the kitchen door unlocked and blood seeping through the ceiling from the floor above. Her screams brought neighbors running, and within an hour the entire community knew that something terrible had happened at the boarding house. Local law enforcement arrived to find chaos, their faces pale as they climbed the stairs and discovered body after body. State police followed, then more federal agents from Louisville and Lexington, all struggling to comprehend how a single person could have accomplished such devastation. Witnesses were interviewed throughout the day. Several reported seeing a woman matching Maggie Bailey's description walking through town in the pre-dawn hours, calm and purposeful, showing no signs of the carnage she had committed. Deputies were dispatched to the Bailey cabin immediately, but they found it cold and empty, no sign of Maggie or any indication of where she might have gone. Her daughters claimed to have slept through the night and awakened to find their mother gone. The manhunt that would dominate the next several months was officially begun, and that manhunt would prove to be one of the largest and most frustrating in American history. You see, the response from the federal government was unprecedented in scale and fury. Within a week, over 500 law enforcement officers had been deployed to eastern Kentucky, including agents from multiple federal agencies and National Guard units called up by a panicking governor. They came with dogs and horses and the latest in tracking equipment, determined to find the woman who had humiliated their agency and murdered their colleagues. They set up command posts in every town within 50 miles of Harlan, coordinated their search patterns with military precision, and promised that Maggie Bailey would be captured within days. But the mountains had other ideas, that's right. These hills had been sheltering fugitives and outlaws for as long as people had lived among them, and they did not give up their secrets easily. The federal agents, most of them city men who had never spent a night in the wilderness, found themselves hopelessly outmatched by terrain that seemed designed to confuse and exhaust them. Trails that appeared on their maps turned out to lead nowhere. Streams that should have been crossable became impassable torrents after mountain rains. Ridges that looked easily climbable from a distance proved to be walls of loose rock and tangled vegetation that turned back even the most determined pursuers. They searched every hollow, every abandoned mine shaft, every barn and outbuilding in a 50-mile radius. They interrogated anyone who had ever known Maggie Bailey, threatening prosecution for anyone found to be aiding the fugitive. They offered rewards that grew larger with each passing week, starting at $5,000 and eventually reaching $50,000. But the people of Harlan County had closed ranks around one of their own. That's right. Maggie Bailey had become something more than a fugitive, more than a killer. She had become a symbol of everything the mountain people had suffered at the hands of distant authorities. Families who had never known Maggie personally left food at predetermined locations in the woods. Preachers who publicly condemned violence privately prayed for her safety. Even those horrified by what she had done understood why she had done it, and understanding bred a loyalty that no reward could overcome. Maggie survived in the wilderness through skills passed down through generations of mountain people, knowledge that city-bred agents could not match. She knew which plants were safe to eat and which streams were clean to drink from, which caves would shelter her from winter's fury. She moved constantly, never staying in one location longer than a few days, always watching for the searchers who combed the mountains with increasing desperation. The winter of 1932-1933 was brutal, with temperatures dropping well below zero. But Maggie endured it all. Her daughters received coded messages through trusted intermediaries, brief assurances that their mother was alive and determined to remain free. Sarah and Elizabeth had been questioned repeatedly by federal agents, threatened with prosecution if they were found to be in contact with the fugitive. But they maintained their ignorance with the stubbornness their mother had taught them. They continued to live in the family cabin, continued to tend the garden, continued to be visible in the community, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. The federal government's response extended beyond the immediate manhunt to encompass broader punitive measures against the community. Agents conducted raids throughout the county with increasing frequency and aggression, often without warrants, often destroying property and assaulting those who objected. They arrested people on pretextual charges, holding them for days before releasing them without explanation. These tactics, intended to pressure the community into betraying Maggie, had exactly the opposite effect. The heavy-handed enforcement created new enemies every day, turning people who had initially been horrified by the massacre into sympathizers who saw Maggie as a hero. Churches began holding prayer services for her safety, not openly but in coded language that everyone understood. Her name was invoked in songs that spread throughout the Appalachian region. Children played games in which Maggie outsmarted federal agents, and parents did not discourage them. The legend was growing even as the woman herself remained hidden. As winter deepened, Maggie found refuge in a place that seemed designed by fate for her circumstances. The old Hawkins mine had been closed for 15 years, ever since a collapse killed 17 workers, including her own husband, Samuel. The mine's reputation for being haunted kept most people away, including federal agents who relied on local guides who refused to go near it. The mine's complex tunnel system offered multiple escape routes, and its depths maintained a constant temperature that was warm enough to survive. She lived there for months in near-total darkness, her eyes adjusting until she could navigate the tunnels with only faint candlelight. She emerged only at night to gather supplies from caches that supporters had placed at designated locations. Sometimes she would pause at Thomas's grave, spending hours beside the mounded earth, speaking to her son in whispers that no one else could hear. These were the only times she allowed herself to feel anything beyond cold determination. The federal government eventually realized that force was not going to capture Maggie Bailey. A new approach was developed, one relying on negotiation rather than aggression. Word was passed through the mountain grapevine that the government was willing to make a deal, that surrender might not mean execution, that Maggie's daughters would be protected if their mother came in peacefully. The offer was designed to appeal to maternal instincts that the government assumed were stronger than any desire for continued resistance. Maggie received the offer in her underground refuge and considered it carefully over 3 days. She weighed her desire to see her daughters against her certainty that federal justice would mean death, either officially through execution or unofficially in some prison. She thought about what surrender would mean to the people who had supported her, whether it would be seen as a betrayal. She thought about Thomas, about what he would have wanted, about whether he would have preferred a mother who fought to the end. Her response became legendary throughout the region and beyond. She sent back a single piece of paper on which she had written her conditions for surrender. She demanded that the government publicly admit that Harold Whitmore had murdered an innocent child without provocation. She demanded that they acknowledge their enforcement tactics had driven desperate people to desperate acts. She demanded reparations to every family harmed by revenue agent violence. She demanded, in other words, that they admit they were wrong. The government rejected these conditions immediately, dismissing them as the ravings of a madwoman. But Maggie's response had accomplished what she intended. She had framed the conflict as one of justice rather than simple crime. Newspaper editorials that had condemned her began suggesting that perhaps the government bore some responsibility. Politicians who had supported aggressive enforcement faced uncomfortable questions from constituents who wondered whether their policies had gone too far. Spring arrived in the Kentucky mountains with its usual mix of mud and wildflowers, and Maggie Bailey remained free despite the most intensive manhunt the region had ever witnessed. The federal agents were growing weary and demoralized, many requesting transfers to other assignments. The boarding house where the massacre occurred was avoided by locals and visitors alike, its owners unable to find tenants for rooms that still bore bloodstains. The legend of Maggie Bailey had grown beyond anything anyone could have predicted. Her daughters made the dangerous journey to visit her one final time in late April, guided through mountains by trusted friends who knew paths that appeared on no maps. They found their mother in a cave near the top of a ridge, thinner and harder than they remembered, her hair now streaked with grey. But she was alive, and her eyes still held the fierce light they had known since childhood. When she embraced them, they felt the same strength that had sustained the family through every hardship. They spent 3 days together, the longest continuous time Maggie had spent with anyone since going into hiding. She told them everything, her plans and motivations, her understanding of what she had done. She asked them to forgive her for the violence and for leaving them behind. She told them she was proud of them, that they had shown courage their father would have admired. She told them about Thomas, about the boy he had been and the man he might have become, about the hole his death had torn in everything she was. On the last evening of their visit, Maggie led her daughters to a spot high on the ridge where they could see for miles in every direction. The sun was setting behind them, painting the sky in colors that no artist could capture. For a moment, they were just a family watching the day end. Maggie pointed out landmarks they knew, the creek where they had learned to fish, the ridge where the best berries grew. She was saying goodbye, though she did not use those words, and her daughters understood. They left the next morning with instructions not to return, not to attempt contact, not to do anything that might lead searchers to their mother. Maggie watched them go from her vantage point, tracking their progress until they disappeared into the forest. Then she turned back to the cave that had been her home. She knew she could not continue indefinitely, that the searchers would eventually find her, or her body would give out. She had made her peace with death long ago, but she would choose its timing and manner, would deny the government the satisfaction of capturing or killing her. 3 days after her daughters left, federal agents finally tracked Maggie Bailey to the ridge, betrayed by a distant cousin who had accepted a sum of money large enough to overcome whatever loyalty he had felt. They surrounded the cave before dawn, 300 armed men positioned to ensure no escape. When they called for surrender, there was no response, only mountain wind and the first birdsong of morning. They waited for hours before finally approaching with weapons drawn. What they found inside would be described in newspaper accounts and history books for generations to come. Maggie Bailey sat in a chair facing the eastern entrance, positioned to watch the sunrise over the mountains she had loved since childhood. Her hands rested in her lap, one holding a photograph of Thomas. Beside her sat a small bottle that had once contained the same whiskey her family had made for generations, now empty. She was dead, had been dead for hours, her face bearing an expression of peace that seemed almost defiant. She had chosen her own ending on her own terms, denying the government the satisfaction of a trial or execution. The poison she had used worked quickly and painlessly. A letter addressed to her daughters was found in the cave, along with instructions for her burial. She had known exactly how this would end, and had arranged every detail according to her wishes. The letter spoke of love and loss, of impossible choices that grief forces upon those left behind, of her certainty that she would see Thomas again in whatever came after. She asked them to forgive her for everything, for the violence and the hiding and the pain her death would cause. She explained that she could not have survived capture, could not have endured being caged while those who approved her son's murder faced no consequences. She told them the mountains would always protect them, that their family's legacy was survival against impossible odds. The federal government announced Maggie Bailey's death as a successful conclusion to the manhunt, framing the suicide as evidence of guilt. But public reaction forced them to modify this narrative immediately. Protests erupted across Kentucky and beyond. People who had followed the case saw something different in her death, not guilt, but defiance, not cowardice, but courage, a final act of resistance by a woman who had refused to submit to an authority she considered illegitimate. Her daughters fulfilled her final wishes, burying Maggie beside Thomas under the oak tree. Over 1,000 people attended from throughout the Appalachian region. They stood on the hillside in spring sunshine, listening to hymns and eulogies, many weeping for a woman they had never met but felt they understood. The gravesite would become a pilgrimage destination for decades. The Maggie Bailey case became a turning point in federal approach to enforcement in rural areas. The tactics that had produced such disaster were quietly abandoned. Politicians who had advocated for aggressive crackdowns found their positions untenable. None of this could undo what had happened, could bring back Thomas or the 19 agents or Maggie herself. But it represented a shift that those who had lived through the events recognized as significant. In the decades since, Maggie Bailey has been remembered in countless ways. Folk musicians wrote songs about her that spread through mountain communities. Historians analyzed her case as an example of governmental overreach and popular resistance. Politicians invoked her name when arguing for or against various policies. The boarding house site became a historical marker. Her grave became a destination for those who saw her as a martyr and a hero. Her descendants still live in those Kentucky hills, carrying a name that evokes both pride and burden. Some have embraced the family legacy, Others have tried to distance themselves. All have been shaped by a story they can neither escape nor fully understand. The mountains of eastern Kentucky remain today much as they were in 1932, ancient and patient and indifferent to human drama. Federal agents still occasionally pass through, but they do so with caution born of historical memory. What Maggie Bailey did cannot be justified by any conventional moral framework. She killed 19 men, most of whom had nothing to do with her son's death. She traumatized families who had done her no harm. The violence was disproportionate by any measure, fueled by grief that consumed all perspective. These facts cannot be dismissed, and yet her story cannot be simply condemned. She was a mother who watched her child murdered by agents who faced no accountability, a woman pushed beyond every limit into a place where violence seemed like the only remaining language. Her story challenges us to consider what we ourselves might do in similar circumstances, what any parent might do when faced with such loss. It offers no comfortable conclusions, only the raw fact of human capacity for both cruelty and consequence. The agents who killed Thomas never imagined their action would result in 19 deaths. Maggie never imagined her life would end this way when she woke on that August morning. All were swept up in forces larger than themselves. The oak tree that shelters Thomas and Maggie Bailey still stands on that Kentucky hillside. Its branches, now massive and ancient. It has witnessed nearly a century since 1932, has sheltered generations of birds and deer, has provided shade for those who come to pay respects. Local people still visit on the anniversaries, leaving flowers and tokens of remembrance. Some pray for the souls of those who died. Others simply stand in silence, contemplating the chain of events that began with a child's murder and ended with a mother's final choice. History remembers Maggie Bailey in many ways, depending on who tells her story. To some, she remains a cold-blooded killer, a cautionary tale about allowing emotion to override law. To others, she is a hero who struck back when no other recourse remained. Proof that even the most powerful can be held accountable. The truth lies somewhere between, in the complicated territory where grief and violence and love intersect. The story endures because it speaks to something fundamental in human experience. It is the story of a mother's love and what that love becomes when everything it protects is stripped away. It is the story of power and resistance, of governments that forget they serve people and people who remind them in terrible ways. It is the story of the American mountains and the fierce independence they breed. Now, the photograph of Thomas that Maggie held in her final moments was later given to her daughters, who kept it in a place of honor in the family cabin for the rest of their lives. It showed a boy with dark eyes and a shy smile, standing beside the oak tree that would become his grave, captured in a moment of innocence that the photograph preserved even as time swept everything else away. Sarah and Elizabeth would look at that photograph on difficult days, remembering their brother's laugh, his curiosity, his boundless energy, and they would understand again why their mother had done what she did. Not justify it, perhaps, but understand it in a way that went beyond words or explanations or moral frameworks. The agents who died in the boarding house were buried in their hometowns across Kentucky and beyond, their families receiving flags and condolences from a government that praised their sacrifice without acknowledging its role in creating the circumstances of their deaths. Some of those families harbored hatred for Maggie Bailey that lasted generations. And who could blame them? They had lost fathers and sons and brothers, men who were just doing their jobs, men who bore no personal responsibility for what had happened to Thomas Bailey. The 19 graves scattered across America represented 19 tragedies, 19 families shattered, 19 stories that ended too soon. This was the true cost of what happened in that hollow in 1932, a cost that extended far beyond the immediate participants. You see, the boarding house itself stood empty for 2 years after the massacre, its owners unable to find anyone willing to rent rooms where so much blood had been shed. Local children dared each other to approach it at night, claiming they could hear screams from the second floor, inventing ghost stories that mixed with real history until no one could separate them. When it was finally demolished in 1935, a crowd gathered to watch the wrecking ball reduce it to rubble, and some swore they saw a woman's figure in an upstairs window just before the walls collapsed. Whether this was true, or merely the kind of embellishment that attaches to all such stories, the boarding house entered local legend alongside Maggie herself. The federal government never officially acknowledged wrongdoing in the death of Thomas Bailey, though internal documents released decades later revealed that investigators had concluded the shooting was unjustified and that Harold Whitmore should have faced disciplinary action at minimum. These documents were suppressed at the time for fear of encouraging further resistance, a decision that historians would later cite as evidence of the institutional arrogance that had created the disaster in the first place. Justice delayed was justice denied, and by the time the truth emerged, everyone who might have benefited from it was long dead and buried in these ancient hills. That's right. The story of Maggie Bailey became one of those tales that mountain people told around fires and passed down through generations, a story that grew larger with each telling. Some versions had her killing 30 agents instead of 19. Others claimed she had escaped to live out her days in Mexico or Canada. A few insisted she had never really died at all, that the body found in the cave belonged to someone else, and that Maggie Bailey was still out there somewhere, watching over the hills she had loved. These variations didn't matter to the people who told them. What mattered was the core truth, that a mother had struck back against those who had taken everything from her. The coal companies that had brought so much suffering to this region continued their operations for decades, extracting wealth from the mountains while leaving poverty and environmental devastation in their wake. The same forces that had driven families to moonshine production continued to operate. The same desperation that had created Maggie Bailey's circumstances continued to shape the lives of subsequent generations. The specific actors changed, but the fundamental dynamics remained, and the story of what happened in 1932 served as a reminder that pushed hard enough, ordinary people were capable of extraordinary things. Sarah Bailey married a man from a neighboring county in 1938 and raised 4 children of her own, never once speaking publicly about her mother or her brother. She kept the photograph of Thomas in a drawer by her bedside, and her children knew not to ask about the woman in black who visited the family grave on certain anniversaries. Elizabeth never married, choosing instead to remain in the family cabin and tend to the land that had been Bailey territory for generations. She became a figure of some mystery in the community, a woman who kept to herself, but who was said to know things, to remember things, to carry secrets that would die with her. The songs about Maggie Bailey spread through the Appalachian region and beyond, carried by musicians who recognized in her story something that resonated with their audiences. Some of these songs portrayed her as a hero, a mountain woman who had stood up to tyranny and paid the ultimate price. Others were more ambiguous, acknowledging the tragedy of what she had done while refusing to condemn it entirely. The most famous of these songs, written by a Kentucky fiddler named Walter Morrison in 1945, became a standard in the folk music repertoire and introduced Maggie's story to audiences who had never heard of Harlan County or the hollows where she had lived and died. The academic study of the Maggie Bailey case began in the 1960s, when historians started examining the broader patterns of conflict between rural communities and federal authority during the Prohibition era. Her case became a central example in discussions of proportionate response and the limits of state power, cited by scholars on both sides of various debates. Some argued that her actions were understandable if not justifiable, a predictable response to intolerable provocation. Others contended that nothing could excuse the murder of 19 men, that the rule of law must be maintained regardless of individual grievances. The debate continued for decades without resolution. The graves beneath the oak tree have been maintained by Bailey descendants and sympathetic community members for nearly a century now. The headstones are simple, bearing only names and dates, but everyone who visits knows the larger story. Fresh flowers appear regularly, left by people who feel a connection to what happened there, who see in Maggie Bailey's story something that speaks to their own experiences of loss and injustice, and the desperate measures that grief can inspire. The site is not officially recognized as a historical landmark, but it functions as one nevertheless, a place of pilgrimage for those who remember. Now, the specific circumstances that produced Maggie Bailey's tragedy have changed in the decades since her death. Prohibition ended in 1933, removing the legal prohibition on alcohol that had driven so much conflict. Federal enforcement tactics have evolved, at least in some ways, with greater emphasis on procedure and less tolerance for the kind of aggressive overreach that characterized the 1932 raid. But the underlying tensions between rural communities and distant authorities have not disappeared. They have merely taken new forms, found new flashpoints, produced new tragedies that echo the old ones in disturbing ways. The mountains of eastern Kentucky today face different challenges than they did in Maggie Bailey's time. But the economic desperation that drove families to moonshine production has not been solved. Coal mining has declined, leaving communities without the primary industry that once sustained them. Drug addiction has reached epidemic proportions, destroying families and communities in ways that the old feuds and the revenue wars never did. The federal government has again become a significant presence, this time enforcing drug laws rather than liquor laws, and the results have sometimes been similarly tragic. Those who know the history of these hills can see the patterns repeating, can recognize in contemporary conflicts echoes of what happened in 1932. The specifics change, but the dynamics remain, the collision between people who feel abandoned by the larger society and authorities who see them as problems to be controlled rather than citizens to be served. Whether this cycle will ever be broken is a question that no one can answer. But understanding the history is essential for anyone who hopes to try. The Bailey family line continues to this day, spread across Kentucky and beyond, carrying a name that still evokes strong reactions among those who know its history. Some family members have embraced their heritage, speaking at commemorative events and cooperating with researchers who want to understand what happened. Others have tried to escape it, changing their names and moving to places where no one has heard of Maggie Bailey or the 19 men who died in that boarding house. Both responses are understandable, products of a legacy that offers no easy accommodation. And today, that hollow in Harlan County remains a destination for those who remember, for those who understand what happened there in 1932. The cabin is gone now, rotted away and reclaimed by the forest, its location marked only by a slight depression in the earth where the foundation once stood. The still house is gone too, and the spring house, and all the other structures that once made this a working homestead. But the oak tree still stands, massive and ancient, its roots intertwined with the remains of those who rest beneath it. The creek still flows through the hollow, and the birds still sing the same songs they sang on that August morning when everything changed. The tunnel where Thomas used to play, a natural formation in the rock behind the cabin, still exists, though it is overgrown now and difficult to find unless you know where to look. Local people say that sometimes, on quiet evenings, you can hear a child's laughter echoing from within, the ghost of a boy who never grew old enough to see the ocean or ride a train or fly in an airplane as he had dreamed. Whether this is true or merely the kind of story that attaches to places where terrible things have happened, it adds another layer to the legend that has grown around this hollow and the people who lived and died here. What about you, my friend? Would you make that journey to stand where Maggie Bailey stood, to see the hills she loved and the grave where she rests beside her son? Would you walk the paths she walked, breathe the same mountain air, feel the same wind that has blown through these hollows since before humans came to settle here? The journey is not easy. The roads are narrow and winding, and the hollow itself is difficult to access. But those who make the effort say it is worth it, that standing in that place and knowing that history brings something into focus that cannot be captured in words or photographs or even the most careful historical accounts, the mountains keep their secrets, holding the memory of Maggie Bailey close, like they hold the morning mist and the evening shadows, and the countless other stories of those who have lived and died among these ancient peaks. Her story will continue to be told as long as people remember what happened in that hollow in 1932, as long as parents love their children with a ferocity that defies reason, as long as governments abuse their power and people find ways to resist. She is gone now, dust mingling with her son's dust beneath that ancient oak, but what she did and what was done to her echoes still through time and will continue to echo for generations yet to come. And that, my friend, is the true story of Maggie Bailey, the mother who slaughtered 19 federal agents in one night of vengeance for the murder of her 10-year-old son. A story of love and loss, of justice and vengeance, of the limits of human endurance and what happens when those limits are exceeded. The mountains remember, and through them, so do we all.